This video introduces 3 workflow management actions. With these options, you can automate pausing the workflow, holding all actions, or starting an additional workflow at certain points in your process. Pause workflow will shut down the entire workflow until it is manually unpaused inside the project. This action can be used strategically to stop a workflow that no longer applies after a certain milestone. The only thing you need to select here is the appropriate trigger. No matter where a pause workflow action is placed in the workflow, once it is triggered, any actions that have not run are not going to run, ever, unless you unpause the workflow later. If you want the workflow to be discontinued, this action is a great hands-off solution. However, if you only want the workflow to pause temporarily, this action will require extra manual steps in your process. When the workflow pauses, you will not get a notification and you will not receive any to-do reminders to unpause the workflow. You will need to monitor your workflows manually and unpause them by hand when appropriate. The workflow pause action should be used sparingly as a last resort. Before adding an automatic workflow pause, ask yourself why you want to pause the workflow and if there is another trigger or action that could create a similar effect. Hold actions until prevents future actions with the trigger after all previous actions complete from running until a certain condition is met. This action can be tricky to wrap your head around, but if used intentionally, it will allow for advanced customization and control. The only thing you need to select inside this action is the appropriate trigger. The real strategy comes from the placement of the action in your workflow, the triggers on upcoming actions, and whether you're using multiple hold actions in a row. An action to hold actions until will only affect future actions with the trigger after all previous actions complete. Those will be suspended until the trigger on hold actions until is met. This action will not affect actions with a different trigger. Those will continue to fire as normal even if the condition on hold actions until has not been met. If you use multiple hold actions in a row, multiple conditions must be satisfied before the future actions are released to run. Hold actions until is the right choice when there are multiple conditions that should happen before the rest of the workflow can move forward. If there's only one condition, try to use a specific trigger to meet that condition instead of hold actions until. If your scenario can't be done with triggers alone, be sure to test your workflow thoroughly before using it with a real client. Start a workflow applies and activates an additional workflow on the same project. This action is useful if you set up shorter workflows for phases of your process and you want the current phase to trigger the next phase automatically. You can choose the workflow template from the drop-down and the appropriate trigger for this action. Workflows running simultaneously on the same project do not communicate with one another. Each workflow must be structured to be self-contained. Additionally, the start a workflow action cannot be used to create a recurring workflow because a workflow template cannot be applied to the same project more than once at a time. For example, you cannot start workflow A from within workflow A. You would need to manually remove workflow A from the project before applying it again.